excited. I'm really excited about this session. I always feel so privileged when I get a chance to speak with all of the brilliant people we have on the call today. I actually joined Collaborate after spending most of my career working in and with the voluntary sector, because I always felt surely there must be a better and different way of civil society and the public sector working together in a way that's more about shared purpose, that gets beyond traditional power dynamics and actually just lets us work together to put people and communities first. And it's the work, it's the behaviours, it's the leadership of people on the call today that gives me so much hope that change is possible. I think all of our speakers today will acknowledge that none of us have all the answers, there's a long way to go, but I think they're creating foundations that are beginning to show that a different way is possible. And also that civil society organisations can kind of step into their power and have that greater sense of agency in terms of nurturing local collaboration so that support works better for local people. So yeah, I'm hugely excited to have the opportunity to dig into these questions today based on examples of work all over the country. So the format of today is, firstly, we'll hear some intros from our speakers. You'll get to know a little bit about them. And then the bulk of today's session will be in conversation with our speakers today. So I've got 3 key questions we're going to explore. One around how they ended up taking on the system stewardship role, one about how they view their role in relation to power, and one about what different practices stewardship requires as a steward, but also of others in the local place. Towards the end of the session, we'll have around 20 minutes for questions. So please do use the chat throughout to share any reflections, comments, and use the Q&A, as Gwen said, to note down any questions you'd like to pose to our panel. We really want this to be as interactive as possible, answer as many questions that you have. So before we get started and before I hand over to the speakers, I just wanted to briefly explain, give some context to the idea of system stewardship, which today's session is all about. And whether they use the label all the time or not, I think all of the people on the call today, we're broadly together connected by the idea of being civil society organisations that play a system stewardship role. You might know, as you get to hear about system stewardship, you might know it by other names like systems convening. There's some similarities with systems leadership. I heard someone talking about bridging in a session yesterday. So for me, the name doesn't matter so much. It's more about recognising, developing this quite specific practice, which is quite a different role in some respects for civil society organisations, but also lots of I think lots of more traditional community development type roots to it as well. So one of the key foundations of human learning systems is the idea that outcomes emerge from complex systems. They're not created by single organisations, single projects, programmes or individuals. Outcomes result from the interaction of loads of different actors and factors in all of our lives. And specifically, if we want positive change, we really need to focus on what does a healthy system look like and how can we help nurture that. I always find it easier, sadly, to think of what an unhealthy system is. So I know we're all familiar with, systems that are siloed, competitive, fragmented, not focused on the voice and needs of the people we're there to support. So today is all about, so what does it take to nurture a healthy system that's the opposite of all of those things, defined by shared purpose, deep listening and involvement of the people we want to support, trusting relationships, collaboration. So that's what today's conversation is all about. And in HLS, we see system steward as a person, an organisation, a group that takes responsibility for trying to nurture a healthy system. So developing conditions like trust, relationships, deep listening and learning, helping people work better together towards common goals. So by establishing these foundational conditions, we believe positive outcomes are more likely to emerge from the system. And for me, one of the things that's really interesting is, people and organisations in positions of formal power can be system stewards. So funders and commissioners, we've heard several examples throughout the week of. So yesterday I was talking to commissioners in Liverpool about them playing a system stewardship role. We heard from Gary in Plymouth on Monday about how as a public health team they're taking on a stewardship role. But actually civil society organisations can also be system stewards. And what we've found through the HLS work so far is it's not about formal power, it's legitimacy is what's important in being a steward. And actually sometimes civil society organisations do have greater legitimacy to play this role. Sometimes civil society organisations can kind of bridge better between formal services and between local communities. There's that trust on both sides. And civil society organisations can also be sometimes better placed to question and disrupt the way things are done. The stewardship role looks different in different contexts, but there are some fundamental common features as well, and a distinct practice that we think is important and exciting. And part of today is helping to kind of recognise and develop that practice. So hopefully today you'll get a flavour of both of what's common, what's different, and then some inspiration for your work as well. So now I'm going to hand over for some quick intros. So Kate, can I come to you first? If you tell us who you are, where you're from, and you're also going to explain for us one feature of system stewardship that you do in your work.
Thank you, Dawn. I'm Kate Newton-Smith. I'm a white woman wearing blue polo neck and short hair with glasses in my 50s. And I'm the chief exec of Surrey Youth Focus. As the name says on the tin, we work in Surrey, the county of Surrey, serving children and young people ultimately. Our background is we started as a traditional CVS, Council for Voluntary Services, serving the third sector. But now we definitely describe ourselves as well as system stewards or system leaders. And our practice that we do, one of the practices we do is bringing people together and building relationships. And we do that in a variety of ways. We do a lot of one-on-one, bringing people together in introductions, saying, oh, I think you should be talking to this person. We do a lot of welcoming new people into the system, running new starters networks, and that's for the public sector and the third sector. So we run a lot of events that are for both the third sector and the public sector. And but particularly we do convening around different topics and meetings. And sometimes that will come from an issue that we've seen around the system, something we see going on that we think needs addressing to serve children and young people better. A recent example is emotionally based school non-attendance. But sometimes it's for other organisations ask us to do it. So we also recently did something around children's mental health and bringing together practitioners in a particular location. But the one thing is we like to start with a blank piece of paper wherever possible, so that everyone in the room gets to shape it from the beginning. Thanks, Dawn.
Thanks, Kate. Amanda, can I come to you next?
Yes, hi. So my name's Amanda Kilroy, and I am sat in Exeter today in CoLab Exeter. So I'm sat in the office at the moment. I am a very, very pale-skinned woman. I'm going to say middle-aged. I'm not going to name my age, but wearing well. And I'm wearing a pale green top today, so hopefully you can visualise that wherever you are. And CoLab Exeter, which is the windows you can see behind me, lead out into a big multi-agency space where we've got about 30 different organisations and projects working together from across sectors, statutory, private, VCSE, all working around people who have complex lives, multiple disadvantages. And we are the lead agency in the space, so we convene lots of different conversations and activity and influence system change at the same time. And one of the role of system steward has really evolved over time, and it's continuous. I don't think you ever arrive there. I think it's something that evolves all of the time. But one of the key elements of that is being able to really engage in continuous deep listening that involves that kind of span of people. And that for me is really been about listening on lots of different levels, and not only listening but hearing and responding to that. And often it's about how you really listen in different formats by convening those different spaces where people really feel like they're welcome and they're included and they're meant to be there and they can participate. And that isn't a given because those things are often that we have assumptions that people, if you put out an invitation, if you do a consultation, if you host a group, that people will feel like they can just be present. But what we've learned over the years is that you have to think very carefully and very intentionally about how you hold those spaces, and constantly find ways that for bringing in the smallest voice. And so that's really been sort of a key feature of our work.
Thanks, Amanda. Julian, can I hand over to you?
So Julian Penton here, white male, mid-60s, in blue.
Julie Simons, white woman, brownish hair, mid-40s. And I'm wearing my coat over a constellation themed dress because I'm a bit chilly. So we're from Hartley Power, which is based in Hartlepool in the northeast of England, and myself and Julian are both development officers for the voluntary sector development support team, and we that kind of blank piece of paper, we're being fortunate to kind of have that in the creation of our team itself, before realizing a lot of the similarities in the descriptions that have gone before us. So we do all of the traditional kind of things in that, helping people, you know, farm and governance, etc., funding and things like that. But connection is a massive part of things, as Kate said, introductions and connections, networks and themed, and some of our themed work, including the specific piece of work that we're talking about today, the Victoria Award work, has been the ones where I think we have played that stewarding role on a multiple times, and across different agencies. And I would say that they have been our most meaningful pieces of work as a team. So we've been fortunate enough to be allowed to be creative, which I think is an important thing to say as well.
And the work in the Victoria Ward, which is one of Hartlepool's local authority wards, we were invited by the local authority as a voluntary organisation to see whether we could respond more holistically to the fact that by a factor of 3, the Victoria Ward had the most child safeguarding work in the town of Hartlepool, and the enlightened local authority officer asked us and another voluntary organisation to see if we could develop a new response other than the traditional social work response. The area already has a specialist social work team dealing with the social work dimensions of child safeguarding, but there was a recognition that a more holistic approach was likely over time to be more successful. So our work is centred around trying to bring together actors within the system, the various agencies, statutory and voluntary, that are working to some degree or other in that ward. And that has led to a history of attempts to help people understand that they're part of a wider system. And then simultaneously, Julie has led on this aspect of the work, resident engagement, and the attempt to surface the voices of people whose community it is in that ward. It's long, arduous work, and it is very much work in progress, but that's what we are doing.
Thanks both. Layla.
Hi everyone, glad to be here. I'm Layla. I'm a black woman with short natural black hair, and I'm wearing a burgundy polo neck jumper, and I'm quite old, but I look younger than I am, so I'm not going to shatter that illusion. So I'm a director of Black Thrive Global, which is a social enterprise, and our mission is to end systemic racism. And we seek to do that by working with Black communities to make sure that they are at the forefront of reimagining and co-creating a society in which they can thrive. In terms of a lot of our work has elements of system stewardship in it, and we are learning and trying to get better at being system stewards. But today, I think I'll focus mainly on our work around employment, changing the system for Black people with long-term health conditions or who are disabled, which the evidence is clear that the system is not working for them. And so one of the things we discovered was looking at human learning system. It really spoke to the idea that healthy systems produce good outcomes, and that all the flogging and targets and so on was never going to achieve what was needed, but for this particular cohort, certainly. And so that's how we came into doing system stewardship. We hadn't particularly planned it. And one of the roles we play in that is this, is looking at learning and being intentional about learning, to help understand the system, map the system, look at qualitative and quantitative research that others have done, and thinking about, well, how has that impacted on the system? And also in terms of the learning, organizing more formal reflective spaces for actors in the system to come together. And some of the things we've looked at so far in regards to this employment thing is, for example, we've looked at the social model of disability, and we've looked at race and what is it, and how does it show up. Those are just some examples of things which people kind of know, but being more intentional about these things, we feel is a kind of some learning together that will be useful and helpful in practice as we move forward with our work.
Thanks, Layla. And Andrew.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew. I work for CHS. I'm a white male with short brown hair and a beard and glasses and a grey fleece because it's quite cold here. But just a bit about CHS. So CHS stands for Cambridge Housing Society. So we're a housing association, but we've been going almost 100 years. So we have a sort of very deep connection with Cambridgeshire communities, and we've got a very strong belief, which was created by our founders, that housing was a means to an end rather than end in itself. So what we're really interested in are the people, the quality of life of the people we house. It's really that we're focused on. So the housing helps us achieve that, but really my job is to grapple with that question. Well, how on earth do we improve people's quality of life? And our conclusion to that, I suppose, is that with like lots of the people around the table have concluded that a systemic approach to that, especially around people with low incomes, is a way of working which is likely to achieve better outcomes for our tenants and their wider communities. And I think we've realised, I suppose, you know, if you talk to me 10, 15, 20 years ago, we'd have probably said, well, we can do all of that by ourselves. You know, we've got programs, we've got projects, we've got outputs that we can achieve. But our journey has been, well, we've really got, we'll achieve much more if we do this with other agencies and organisations. And one of the things we've paid careful attention to is the power dynamics across the system. So, for example, we receive some public funds to run the Cambridgeshire Local Assistance Scheme, which supports people in with low incomes. And so we're delivering this contract, but unbeknownst to us, there was a very small micro organisation in the village where we are based, which we came across via one of our employees. Now, they had supported 800 families over the last 3 years through just pure volunteering. And there we were with our sort of tens of thousands of pounds that we were receiving from the public sector, and yet they were probably achieving very similar outcomes to us. So we did talk to them, and we really paid careful attention to the power dynamic there, because what we didn't want to do and what we wanted to avoid was them being overloaded with all sorts of referrals from the rest of the system. So we have been really, really careful in terms of that power dynamic, in terms of respecting their autonomy and their capacity. So that's on the sort of micro end of the scale, but there's also the power dynamics up to the funder, I suppose. And what we do across Cambridgeshire is bring various organisations together, public sector, voluntary sector, community sector, faith-based organisations. And what we're really, really careful about is protecting a culture in those meetings that avoids institutional interests, because we have had experience where, particularly probably public sector organisations have attended the meeting and they've got a clear agenda. So we have really been careful about paying attention to that sort of thing.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone. I think you've given such a brilliant example of the breadth of your work, but also some of those common features. So we've heard about bringing people together, a focus on deep listening and involving people, the importance of shared purpose and coming together around common goals, and putting learning at the heart of what we do really intentionally. And as Andrew said, paying attention to power dynamics in lots of different respects. So that gives you a flavour of what system stewardship actually looks and feels like in practice. And now we're going to have a chance for a discussion with our speakers to dig a bit deeper into what that means in their work. So my first question is kind of, how did you end up taking on a system stewardship role, whether you call it that or not? How did you end up taking on this role, and why? Why did you feel like a different approach was needed? Kate, can I come to you first?
Sure. So I could come up with some, grand post-rationalisation that it was all planned, but the truth is it wasn't. I think the very starting point was boredom, actually. I used to represent the third sector in meetings, such as there was the Surrey Safeguarding Children Board, and they weren't talking about the third sector, and I wasn't quite sure what I was doing there, to be honest. And there's one particular turning point where there was a discussion about prem babies. Now, my son was born 3 months early, so it was a subject on which I felt I had some knowledge. I just wasn't comfortable with what was going on, so I started asking some questions and try to understand why some of the practices were going on in the way that they were. But that just started to give me the confidence, and I think I became sort of a bit more of a critical friend to start with. And then another key point was Dave Hill, who was the Director of Children's Services. He came into Surrey about 4 years ago now. And when he came in, I was having a conversation with another charity chief exec, and we were talking about why are the generational cycles of domestic abuse and drug and alcohol and all these things. And we said we want to get a group of people together to talk about it. So I approached the incoming Director of Children's Services, and much to my surprise and delight, he said yes, he'd like to come and join this group. So we had about 8 or 10 of us used to meet regularly on a Friday afternoon and sort of, do some real relationship type work, explaining things. So that I think was the starting point, and it went from there. Very sadly, Dave died suddenly 2 years ago, which was a huge loss. But the work has carried on, and got to the point now where we sort of know the system really well, and we do all sorts of different system stewardship work. So I think that's a very quick potted summary. Thanks, Dawn.
Thanks, Kate. And I guess what strikes me, I've had the pleasure of speaking to kind of some of your health colleagues, children's commissioners, different parts of the voluntary sector, procurement colleagues. And what strikes me is that the legitimacy you have in the stewardship role, because you are trusted by all different parts of the system. Why do you think that is? What do you think has helped you get to that place?
We focus a lot on relationships. We really do. We spend time getting to know people and to keep building them. There's been a lot of turnover in staff in Surrey over the last 4 years, and whenever new people come in, me and my team make the best, the effort to try and welcome them to Surrey and help them to navigate, because it's a large county with a huge number of different organisations and people. So I think we always try to have children and young people as our guiding star. So we're there to, you know, our place at the table originally is about the third sector, representing charities. And obviously, you know, that's what we're there to do. But if we're ever thinking, you know, having a dilemma or something, you know, if it was right for charities but wrong for children, our guiding star has to be doing what's right for children and families. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Kate. And Julian, you've talked a little bit about your work in Victoria Ward, that flexibility you've had to take on a different kind of role. Could you tell us a little bit more about how you took on a system stewardship role and why? And what that's meant in practice for you?
So as we mentioned briefly in our introduction, we were initially invited by the local authority, who were very keen to see what more could be done to address some of the issues that were leading to people, leading to social workers needing to intervene in the lives of families living in the area. Now, there are amongst the reasons for that are the high density, very low rent, private sector housing in the area. We have a steady stream of people moving into Hartlepool from around the country, often fleeing difficult personal circumstances, or even being encouraged by other local authorities to, or arms twisted even, to leave their own areas. So a lot of families come without any connections, often with histories including trauma and domestic abuse. We have a rising asylum seeker community in the area as well, Ukrainian, Syrian, you know, numerous different ethnicities and nationalities. So in terms of addressing the system, we are... No, let me return to your question. So how do we go about doing that? We've basically met every 6 weeks, inviting whoever wishes to make a contribution to work in the area by talking about their work, by putting out any asks that they might make for collaborators or help, advising people of events or initiatives as they come up. So much like Kate has described, we are very much in the business of trying to cultivate trusting working relationships between people, which we see as absolutely crucial to, well, any effective work actually, but particularly in terms of system stewardship. We're not particularly comfortable with the term system stewardship because it does imply a certain power role, and one needs to be mindful of others' perceptions of people who are perceived as taking on a power holding role. So we're quite anonymous in terms of any title attached to our role. We do it in good faith because we strongly believe that there is a meaningful system that surrounds all of this work that goes on from multiple different agencies that impacts on people living in this particular geographical area, population about 1,200 people in Hartlepool. So in a way, we are trying to surface awareness of there being a system and the importance of people understanding their own role in relation to others. So that is a continuous process of just plugging away at assiduously recording what is mentioned in the meetings, keeping the distribution list alive, bringing people together. We had an opportunity through the Engage Britain initiative, which some people may have heard of recently, to hold a couple of events. But parallel to that work, which is almost exclusively involving agencies, is the work with residents, the people about whom all this work is directed, if you like. And I mentioned Julie having led on that. Julie's had to go, unfortunately, but that has been the process, starting with families and children, because that was our initial ask from the local authority. We've delivered roughly monthly family and family fun type events, and through that built up a little bit of a network of parents who've engaged more or less frequently in those. And we've now helped them to establish a WhatsApp group so that they can talk to one another and set up their own priorities and support one another as they wish. Ideally, the stewardship role would bring together the voices of people who live in the area and the agencies who are ploughing away doing their thing. And there is a range of how responsive and how open to listening those agencies are. But as I mentioned, the process of developing a system and system stewardship, though we don't use those terms, is hard work, and it requires plugging away over months and months. And in terms of, I suppose the other aspect of the system is that there are many kind of areas of national policy, such as housing policy, that impact on people's experiences in the area. So ultimately, the system sort of stretches out, you know, right to the heart of government. So, for example, to hear that the no-fault evictions, or the promise to get rid of the idea might now be ditched, you know, will have a huge impact in Hartlepool, because road landlords, there are some good landlords, but those road landlords who offer really low quality housing, and, you know, really it's kind of the opposite to Andrew's organisation, CHS's ethos, you know, that causes huge problems. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Dawn?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks, Julian. And I think there's a huge sense of hope I took in what you did, that weaving together of everyone's contributions, helping the CBR all part of the system, and we can achieve so much more together. But as you say, the hard slog that is the reality of doing this work, of actually getting people to be more receptive to listening to residents. And you set us up nicely for our next question, which is all about power. So my next question is, how do you view your role in relation to power? So I think as a group, we've had loads of conversations over the last year or so about the fact that, you know, stewardship is about kind of stepping into your power more, realizing your power as a civil society organisation, but also being really conscious of how you hold that power. You do hold it, you can't get away from it, but how do you use it in a really conscious way? And how do you use that power in a way that does try to address power imbalances elsewhere in the system? So Amanda, can I come to you first? How do you view your role in relation to power, whether it's with community members, whether it's the public sector or the voluntary sector? How do you?
I mean, and just kind of linking it into the previous speaker, and just kind of thinking about that reality, and thinking about our journey, and how as an infrastructure organisation about 10 years ago, when there was funding that came out to transform local infrastructure so it would redefine itself, I think that it felt like at that moment there was both a cutting off of funding and also an opportunity to be something really different. And that really propelled us on a journey of freeing ourselves from the straitjacket of expectation. You know, we were an umbrella organisation which gave you a certain legitimacy and power. It gave you a seat at the table. It gave you a certain ability to offer and do certain things, but it was also quite limiting. And at the time, NAVCA produced a report in which they described infrastructure as being more about being an enabler, broker and catalyst. And there was something very freeing about that. And I've never really forgotten it, how that gave us license and permission and opportunity to convene and to hold conversations in very different ways, and to actually call out practices that we were seeing and policies and initiatives, one after another, transformation initiatives after transformation initiatives, and just to say, well, you know, hang on a minute, where and how do we do this? And so in terms of thinking about how you hold space. And again, back to who is included in that and how do you hear them. There was a lot in that then about how you set yourself up. So we talked a lot about being, I think it's a Margaret Wheatley term, as leader as host. And so as the leader, you are a servant to the outcome and you're a servant to the people that are involved. And so that immediately, the way that you convene the space sets the power dynamics. And that is where really what we look for and what we've always looked for all the way along are ways in which the voices and the people can come in as themselves. And that's what's been the real difference, that, you know, it's great if you're the local commissioner and you're bringing in part of the funding conversation, but actually we're more interested if you care about this and that you want to have this conversation. And so we went through a whole period where people talked about leaving their lanyards at the door, so that they could come in and have a conversation that was just a lot more equal. And it felt like that, you know, that people in the room could speak as they were. And sometimes it is as simple as that. And we talk about relationships, but it's more than relationships. It's really about then, because relationships, you can be speaking and you can be thinking, well, are we going to get any money? Are they going to cut? Are they trying to tell? Are they just waiting to tell us that we're not going to get funding anymore? And so sometimes the conversation that's happening is not the conversation that's happening, really. So actually conversations all become very neutralized because we don't talk about real things. And so very much in terms of trying to level the playing field, we had so many different ways that we did this. So we used a bit of Theory U, we used cultural values surveys where we actually asked people to come in and talk about their values so that we connect on that level and no one's opinion was any more valid than anybody else's. And Human Learning Systems was a way that we saw a lot of the components come into a whole process. And so I think it is those factors about, rather than saying power is a barrier, we need to overcome it. I don't feel like we ever really focused on that. And just thinking about it in terms of this question, I think we think about that less now, even though it is still an issue. As I'm not saying it's not an issue, but I'm saying we don't focus there. And what we try to focus on is how can we hold this conversation so that it fosters legitimacy? It means people can come as themselves. We're going to have a real conversation. And crucially, that it isn't just going to be a conversation, that there will be action attached to it. So we've talked a lot more about action learning, action research, action in every level of what we're doing, because people are actually very tired of being in lots and lots of different conversations. And certainly our local authority colleagues, I think they've given a statistic of something like 60% of everything that they do is about having a conversation about things, and a less of which percentage happens in actual fact. And so what they said to us, well, we're really excited about spaces where we can join the conversation as ourselves and represent what we can bring into that, but really that level playing field. And one last thing I'll say is, so that's kind of like really close to home, but it's very useful to go out to other places entirely. So one of the big changes on me personally is I went to Canada and studied collective impact there, and I went to lots of different organizations and meetings that were happening, and one of them was a week-long event which was all about sacred civics. And that's kind of about creating places as if people and planet mattered. And running through that was the Indigenous perspective. And that was really talking about how power had been imposed and colonialism, but how now at every level of every part of the system, that perspective was being reintroduced. And I realized in this country, we don't have that in the same way. We're not compelled in that same way. And so we're sort of rootless and looking for what is our kind of core root values. And so that really affects, again, how you hold the space. And I learned a lot about the humility of kind of reconciliation to things that have gone wrong, admitting where we failed, but then saying, but still we can do some really great things. So the absolute power was seeing some of the leaders of the Musqueam nation talking about how, for all that had happened, they still felt really hopeful about a joint future. And that's kind of like what we need to look for here. Despite everything that's happening, where can we dispel some of the very real power dynamics that exist and focus on where we can still have meaningful conversations and do meaningful action?
Thanks, Amanda. That was brilliant. You covered so much ground there.
I know, sorry.
No, it was brilliant. I think what a real theme that's come out this week is the point that, you know, new public management, the world we live in the West, it's our construction. And actually in the global South, there's so much we can learn from the global South in terms of approaching things as much more humanity connection as the starting point, and winding some of the markets metrics managers approach that we've got ourselves into but don't even notice because we're so immersed in it. So yeah, lots to learn from other cultures. Layla, can I come to you next? What's your view on your role in relation to power?
Thanks, Dawn. I think it's interesting. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I change my mind every other day. So this is my view today. Amanda, I loved what you said in terms of being servant to the outcome and servant to the people affected, because in a way, I think that's the kind of mindset shift that we need in terms of understanding our own power and what we can and could do in the system. Because Black Thrive has become quite powerful. We've got quite a lot of resource, we're known and so on. And actually it's quite easy to become sort of, you know, the Mugabe, you know, whereby you fight for freedom and liberation and so on, and then move into quite a space and relationship with power that can actually end up being oppressive. So I think it's really important for those of us that see ourselves as lived experience organizations to ourselves, challenge ourselves on our own power, never mind the power relationship with the system and so on. And so I think there's also something about for me, one of the things I've learned is this thing about the perception of power, and we've talked, as you know, Dawn, in the learning groups that we've got, that power isn't necessarily a zero-sum game. So there's something that about owning the power that you do have. But the key thing is that other people can also have power. So it's not that I have power, therefore you don't. I have power in certain ways and certain things arising from my position, my experience, whatever. But other people can also maximize their power. And I think that one of the advantages and positive things about human learning systems is this placing the individual at the center of their own system, because that already immediately to me flips it into those people affected need to be the people with the power in their own system. And so for us as system steward, I think a lot of what we try to do is to amplify the voices of those who haven't had a voice or don't see themselves as able to connect the system. So we have got the ear of the system, and we can help bring some of those voices to the system. Also bring the system voice to some of the people as well, and so be a bit of a translator, if you like, and between the different actors in the system. And I think that the other thing in terms of power, there's a quote by Habermas, which is a German philosopher, and one of the things he says, which I really like, is that learning, he talks about communicative space, and that's something I've really taken to heart, this idea of opening communicative space as one of the roles of a system steward. And he says that learning communicative space is about learning with others to agree an understanding of the world without resorting to power as a means of persuasion. And I really like that. And I think that that's part of what we try to do as a system steward, is to actually this kind of co-learning, thinking together, sense making together, exploring meaning, but also being willing to let go of your own presumptions and assumptions, because often the truth is that we will be often in the educated at degree, master's, PhD level or whatever, and you're engaging with people who haven't got that, but actually they have got all different kinds of power. And then at a macro level, there's always the power of in a democratic society, which, you know, is you can put pressure, you know, and there's something also about enabling people to see, you know what, you can put pressure and win. So that's what I'll say for now. Just some reflection.
I was about to say that was very powerful, no pun intended. But yeah, weave together so many things again there. And I think, yeah, something else that's come out really strongly for me this week is that point about people need to be at the centre of their own systems. How do we amplify voices, but how do we give people agency as well to see that they can take action? The system is broken, not them. So how can we help people realise that and navigate to a better life for them? And I also love your quote in the chat about stewardship requires us to change our mind every day. I think we're so used to, we have to be right, we have to say something and stick to it. So I think, yeah, that humility that's come up a few times is so important in this role. I'll briefly open it out to others. Anyone else want to comment on power? Maybe particularly, I think we had a question in the chat about with the public sector. So anyone want to comment on power relationship with the public sector and how as a system steward you navigate that role? Kate.
We do actually have some strengths in the third sector related to power, because we don't have this hierarchical thing of governance and all that sort of thing. And quite a lot of what we do, we start outside of governance, and that gives us more strength and more power. We can just invite anyone we want to a meeting, and if we can persuade them, they'll come. Whereas when you're sitting inside the public sector, you know, you've got all this, oh, well, you know, will the politicians like it? Or these people like it, or that people like it, those people like it. And so that's just, you know, another way of thinking about it. Another comment on power, though, as well, is that I did a piece of work not that long ago. And oh, Toby's put, what might your board say about that? My board is very supportive, Toby. They're okay about me getting on and doing stuff. But if you've got more questions, you can ask them. But there's another thing about power, which is I was trying to give it away. I did this project where I was trying to give away power and trying to work with about 10 other chief execs and do some things. And I found the more that I tried to give it away, the more I got, the more that people turned to me to ask my opinion, to come to me, etc. And it's really weird, because I was like, no, there's 11 of us doing this, not just me. And the more I did that, the more people came to me. So it's and I think if you do the opposite of that, I think if you try and hold power to you, often what happens is you actually lose power in the process. So it's a curious thing. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Julian, and I'll briefly come to you and then we'll move on to our final question.
Yeah, on power and the local authority, our experience is that much depends on the personal qualities of the local government officer with whom one is working. And there are people who will really stretch as administrative guerrillas as far as they possibly can within the inevitable constraints of working for a local authority, right the way through along that spectrum to people whom we've been introduced to in the hope that they will respond to our way of working, which is reflected in much of what other speakers have talked about. And they are not in the blindest bit interested, they're just not ready for that, or they just don't see that as being their role. So it's not a simple kind of answer to that. It really is dependent on circumstances and individuals.
Yes, so dependent on individuals being able to find those. I guess, Kate, coming back to your example with Dave Hill, it's been able to find that person who's in the right mindset, willing to listen and willing to engage differently. Thanks, everyone. And that leads nicely on to the final question I wanted to pose to you, which is, what different practices does stewardship require, both of you, but also of others? I think so. Stewardship is you modelling very different behaviours, but also it only works if others also begin to adopt those. Andrew, can I come to you?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the interesting things we've done is to invite people into a different relationship by the way we behave. So we've invited our funder, for example, to have a different relationship with us by being really, really open about all the mistakes we're making, all the risks we're carrying, all the issues that have cropped up. So each meeting we have with our public sector funder, we put it all on the table, and what we're trying to do is invite them into the collective, into that shared purpose. So, and that has worked in the sense that so the organisation I talked about earlier, this small micro-organisation, ran into problems because they would clear houses and take that waste to the recycling centre. And they ran into problems because the waste recycling people said, well, you need a license because you're coming here so frequently that you will need to pay for this. So this came back to us, and so we brought this up in our contract meeting with the local authority and said, here's the problem. So what then happened was that we met with the waste recycling people along with our contract manager, who said, I think I can broker this because they're all part of the same local authority. So that meeting was going nowhere at all until our project manager said, you know, the way we're thinking about this is that we're all part of this sort of ecosystem and we've all got our part to play. And for some reason, the sort of penny dropped with the waste management people. And they said, I can see how we can play our part in this whole system of supporting you guys in terms of alleviating poverty, etc. We didn't realise we had a part to play. So I think there's a role in terms of inviting whoever it is into a different sort of relationship. So that being really open and frank about things is one of the things we've done. And when we facilitate a number of what we call charity networks across the county. Some of them where we've facilitated, some have been offshoots where people have said, actually, we'd rather meet as in Wisbech or March and have our own charities network, and so there have been offshoots from that. But in those meetings, we have deliberately tried to make them meetings about issues and problems, so they become doing meetings rather than update meetings. Because our experience has been in the past that you'd hold a meeting and it would just be a broadcast meeting. They'd be broadcasting, right, well, we've got this funding, and if you can make these referrals into us, we'll be able to do X, Y, and Z with that. What we've tried to do is frame it differently and say, we're working together. We're trying to alleviate poverty and hardship in this area. What are all the problems and issues that you are bumping up against that we can try to solve in this meeting? And so the feedback we're getting about these meetings are people come to them because they are doing meetings rather than talking meetings. And I think that's been a significant shift. And I think one of the other things in terms of our own sort of behaviour, perhaps, is to start from a position of, it's been mentioned several times already, sort of starting from humility, you know, in the sense of we have a part to play, and being really clear what our part is. So we do try to hold ourselves accountable. So we make sure that we do all the things we've said we'll do to engender trust, to try again to invite other people to do the things they said they'd do. And in terms of the last question about the sort of funders and public sectors, I think if we're able to do that, if we're holding ourselves accountable for things, we are then in a position to be able to hold our partners to account in terms of the public sector or so on. So it's kind of a virtual cycle, but it starts from us in terms of inviting people into a different sort of relationship.
Thanks, Andrew. That's really helpful. And yeah, I love the fact you weren't asking permission. You just brought your commissioner into a different type of conversation and let something different emerge from there. Julian, did you also want to come in on this question as well?
Yeah, just briefly, and it's to emphasise something that I think Amanda's put in the chat as well. In terms of behaviour and what one does, I think this establishing of agreed shared outcomes is absolutely critical and central to it. And when one has that and we behave as servants to the outcome, things can happen quite spectacularly. And we've seen a really good example of this over recent years, which was the pandemic. Suddenly, because it was absolutely critical that people were fed, got prescriptions and so on, all of the organisational constraints that one normally associates, well, certainly in Hartlepool, they dissolved. And it turned out that actually it was really easy to do things. And that, I believe, was because there was a really clear shared outcome that everyone signed up to. So I think shared outcomes critical.
Thanks, Julie. And I guess what also strikes me is the importance of organisations like yours in a crisis situation like the pandemic, because you've already got those connections, that trust, those relationships, you know who people are and can galvanise those collective efforts. So thanks, everyone. That was brilliant. We've covered so much ground. At this point, we've had loads of questions, comments, thoughts, so I wanted to bring those in. Gwen, do you want to give us a bit of a flavour of what's going on in the chat? Any questions?
Yeah. Lots of really great exchanges. Just to call out a couple of things that are coming through. I think a lot of really interesting reactions to language, and I think the idea that language both shapes and reflects perspective, that, you know, a little bit of tension on the one hand, that it feels helpful to name and identify and understand the role of system steward, but that role is also one of navigating and changing the balance of power, and understanding. It's really important to understand kind of that role in relationship to others in the system, and how kind of learning and understanding that learning and having your mind change is also central to it. There were kind of different ways that people were describing that role, you know, broker, navigator, enabler, catalyst, translator, lots of really interesting synonyms, I think, for that represent, I guess, the different function of that role. And I think the idea of power and the concept and discussions around that really struck a chord with this group. And also Lois shared with us a really great Martin Luther King Jr. quote. And the idea that a system steward kind of feels more like a servant than a leader, right? And that how you hold space and invite people in that role and kind of sitting as part of the system feels really important. And thanks a lot to John, who's shared some great insights, and also an infographic and report and other resources that people have appreciated. And lastly, I think one concept that he shared, that the communicative space is emergent. And I love this quote: moving from creating safe places where we can meaningfully engage to brave spaces where we can make decisions together. Yeah, and lots of questions too that are starting to come in.
Thanks, Gwen. Lots of I think appreciation from everyone in the chat, but also loads of great ideas, questions. Where to start? I'm
wondering if maybe a good question to kind of open things up, and that is a question from Debbie. She would appreciate feedback, advice, if possible, about the ways and means you have managed to get public engagement, particularly when related to power. She's involved in redesigning mental health services across the region, and finds that people with these experiences kind of perceive themselves as less powerful. Maybe that feels like a kind of a helpful jumping off point. Dawn, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Gwen. So Amanda, this question feels very relevant to you. Do you want to share your thoughts on, particularly for people who perceive themselves as having very little power? How do you build that sense of agency?
Yeah, so over the last 2 years, we have formed an alliance of 6 community organisations, of which we are one, and we are now the Mental Health Alliance for the community. So the commission contracts down into this function, and then we do that work in the space of the community across Pandevon. This is, so it's a big county. And all the things that we've spoken about today, it's kind of like taking what we did at the collab, where we had a lot of control, a lot of agency, a lot of ability to do what we wanted to do, into a different space. So where we're working much more dispersed across the county, and kind of looking at then how do we stay true to our values, you know, as a representative in the community, as part of the community, and wanting to get the best for the community, and really hear our colleagues in terms of what needs to come down from the community mental health framework and how that's delivered in community. And they, you know, I think the commissioners have been really brave in doing this in the start off, that they were creating this partnership. They were putting this power in our hands, and it's just been really interesting to see how we as organisations have handled that, because I think as much as anything else, it's been an experiment in being trusted and having confidence placed in us in a very different way, and just how you respond as a steward, not only of that public money and that work, but also of all the people's whose lives ultimately at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to do that's different. And so a lot of the people that we were representing were those that might typically have been called hard to reach. And so what we basically did within that is we separated it out into two parallel processes, so that one was about the things that we were contractually obliged to deliver, which was kind of a lot on delivery. And there was nothing really in the contract about how we were going to work together. So there's all of these directives now about creating provider collaboratives, but so little investment in how you become and operate as a provider collaborative, remembering that that is people and not just a collection of contracts. And so we knew we needed to do work on the delivery element, but also becoming that partnership at that level of the delivery. And then it was a really small amount of money in comparison to the rest of it, but that was really about what we've called broadly community development. And this is where we have gone into community, we've held events in the community and said, this is what the trust is trying to do, these are the opportunities, there's innovation funds. And it's been so interesting to listen, and we were actually doing another values survey across two of the areas to look at the difference between rural and urban, because it's so marked, the difference, just in terms of where everything is post-pandemic. And so within that, what we're trying to do is to have a space where we're co-producing whatever it is that we do in this space together, so that resource is really dedicated to that. And at the same time, we are building confidence by contractually still delivering on what we are meant to deliver on as someone holding, you know, public contracts for the first time in this way. And so, you know, we've totally accepted that we need to, I don't want to say prove ourselves, but we certainly need to build a strong platform of being able to do that and to deliver. But at the same time, we felt it was very important that we maintain this space where people can continue to be in the space. And just to give you one example, so in one area that we've looked at, and one of the areas ours is in Exeter, where we've been doing a lot of community work. It's probably 3/4 of the efforts are by community sector organisations, 1/4 statutory. In the other area that's had no input, it is 3/4 statutory and 1/4 community sector. So what we've realised there is actually they are the ones that are doing the community sector work, and they would never see themselves as doing that, but they are the people that we've got to partner with every bit as much as the community sector, because they are offering what's there. So again, a lot of those labels and titles of who speaks and who represents what is really blurring when we have a shared outcome and when we're trying to achieve something together. It becomes that you're just speaking as a person, and that's where things really, really start to move in a more authentic way than these people do this and these people can't do that, and there has to be this balance of this. It all becomes a bit artificial. You need to kind of keep an eye on that, but I think having these real spaces is where you kind of get something that's really different. So we're only not even a year into that, but and it's an ongoing challenge, but it has felt like a lot of the groundwork that we've done as a hub has helped us in this space.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, it strikes me how much the groundwork you've done over those 10 years, this couldn't have happened without all those conditions you'd already established, all that trust. And yeah, it always strikes me the contract just never specifies the how, the relationships, but that is what fundamentally is so important and what makes it all work. Would anyone else like to come in on that question? How do you, for those people who feel least powerful in the system, how do you give them more of a voice, more of a sense of agency?
I can chip in a little bit on that, if that's okay. So, yeah, that's really interesting. I think that one of the I think lived experience within the organization is one way that works, but not just, so within Black Thrive, we have a high, apart from being majority, most of us are Black, have lived experience of being Black, but we also have a high proportion of people who have lived experience of mental ill health themselves, or for people they care for. So I've been a carer for 37 years, thereabouts, for example. And by being open about and being able to bring yourself to work, and that's back to the relational, the relationship thing, you can relate to people. I think sometimes I worked in the public sector, mostly local government, for a very long time, and I'm having to unlearn, speaking of learning, unlearn my practices, behaviors, target setting, etc., in order to move forward. And this thing of keeping yourself out of it. So you can bring yourself and your knowledge and learning and humanity. And I think that that's something that generally the public sector doesn't want. So I think in terms of empowering other people, there is something about yourself, bringing yourself and your own vulnerability in a way that enables other people to also open up. And then the other thing I think is by trying something else. So one of the things that we've tried in Black Thrive, and there are about 3 other places now in the country trying it, is the idea of culturally appropriate peer support and advocacy for people who've got mental ill health and particularly work in hospitals. So we brought lived experience people to explicitly address this, and some of the things that have come out are really quite powerful and change the nature of the relationship. So it takes time for people on mental health wards to trust that you're not just part of the system, and that once they start doing it, to listen to what they would find valuable. So there are a range of things from people's sense. That thing about liberty is something that's understated in the mental health system. So reinterpreting and listening and communicating that this person, this is what matters to them. So managed to secure, for example, the CAPSA team has managed to secure some changes for some individuals, which is tiny in many ways, but at the same time, it points to actually you can enable people to be more well, to be better, mentally healthier, by listening and giving them things like a bit of more freedom to go out or to do the thing they enjoy doing on the ward or whatever. And actually, that's not that, it doesn't cost you anything really, and it's not that hard to do, but there's a sense of, you know, a changing. So for me, the experiment, I suppose CAPSA, the culturally appropriate peer support and advocacy, is an experiment in human learning systems terms of try something else. We know this isn't working, try something different. It may or may not work. You may decide at the end, but there's then the building in the learning. You may decide in the end that this wasn't quite it. So we found that there are some things that work. It might be that there are other things that aren't as good, but you can't just plow on with the thing that is not working. And the hugely disproportionate number of Black people within who are coercively brought into mental health services suggests that there is a real problem, and that by listening to people, sometimes it's like organizing sessions on the ward around hair care or some sport or something else, dominoes playing or whatever, you know, there is something about changing the relationship that some of those things do. So simply, if somebody says, I want something, and you can give it to them, it's also about power. You've asked us, you can have what you want. There's no reason why you can't. So there's a different kind of energy that then changes the relationship, that then makes the people feel different, that gives them a sense of agency and power, that potentially leads to them being less unwell, really.
Thanks, Layla. And yeah, the point about humanity just comes out in everything you've just said. Kate, was that a hand up?
Yes, yes. So my expertise is children and young people. And so I would say for them, just about always go to where they are, in the places they're hanging out with their friends, in their schools, in their youth groups, whatever, and use the relationships that they have with adults that they trust. So, and I can tell you how not to do it, is to book a community centre and advertise with leaflets and say, come and tell us what you think. One time I went along to an event someone else organised, and I took my then 14-year-old son. And there was one other person there, which was a chief exec that I knew, and he brought his 14-year-old son along as well. The sons liked it. They had some biscuits together. They were given biscuits they weren't given at home, but it didn't achieve much for what they were trying to achieve with the community consultation. So it really is about going to them. And I've learned lots about from the appreciative inquiry work that Gary Wallace has done in Plymouth. I'm sure it's somewhere on the Human.Learning.Systems website. I was looking for it. I can't immediately pinpoint it. But yes, collecting stories is very powerful. It's something that we've shared the idea across Surrey quite a lot. So, and then you can share the stories of people's personal stories around, rather than them having to come to the meetings and things like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. So I'm going to pick up one final question in the chat before we come to everyone for closing reflections. And there's been quite a few questions about value. So system stewardship is often invisible. Sometimes it doesn't work to call it that. And it's those behind the scenes, the things that aren't in this contract specs. So any thoughts on kind of how we value and resource system stewardship, because it is so fundamentally important. And then also some questions linked to that about, like, how do we know if we're making the system healthier? Is there any way to figure that out? So I'll open that one up. Andrew, Julian, did you want to come in on that one? Andrew?
I can talk a bit about, so one of the things that so that the Cambridgeshire Local Assistance Scheme that we ran, that we picked up 5 or 6 years ago, had nothing in it about system stewardship at all. But our sort of vision for it, and we weren't using that language at the time 5 or 6 years ago, but certainly our vision for it was, well, the whole will be greater than the sum of its parts. That was the kind of, so that's where we're going to go with this. And then we gradually picked up on the work that Toby had done, and the launch of a report in London, and we invited the commissioner along to come along to that meeting, that launch, and then we sort of reflected back what we were learning through our sort of annual reports and quarterly reports and things like that, and started picking up on the HLS language. And then lo and behold, next time the contract was procured, its number one objective is to have a system. They can call it a system, I think it was a system guardian. So it was. So there was this sort of the commissioner learning and going, actually, what you've done over the last 5 years is what we want, and then we will start specifying it. So it became part of the contract. And I suppose that goes back to the being really open with your funder about what you're learning, and kind of, inspiring them too, because one of the things I think in the early reports is this sort of sense of, if you want to do public services differently, you've got this gut feeling that there is a different way of doing it. Well, here's a model, and here's some language that might help you articulate what you have been thinking, and that was certainly true for us.
Thanks, Andrew. Julian, did you want to come in on that question as well?
Okay, so I think what is open to all of us to do is to live it and to respond to circumstances in a way that is based on an understanding that we do work in complex systems. And that means having to adapt what one does not be hidebound by role descriptions, but being a servant to circumstances. And so how we respond is very much dependent on the particular circumstances. Knowing our sort of global aim of the importance of people collaborating, that we're always more effective when we do so, doing so with a consciousness of power differentials and what can be done, what opportunities present themselves to dissolve those a little bit or greatly. When a commissioner starts to use the language and asks for that, that could be an opportunity. On the other hand, it could lead to an almighty scrabble for people who are driven by ego, who love the idea of being called a system steward. And the problem of ego is, I don't know in others, how my colleagues' experiences is an interesting one to consider. But yeah, so doing it and doing it responsively and according to circumstances.
Thanks, Julian. So messages there about doing it, inviting others in. I think as a group, Toby mentioned using the system behaviours to maybe reflect on the health of the system. And that's actually a conversation we've had as a group and where some of the power conversations came from. So I guess, Layla, building on your point earlier about being intentional about learning, I think there's something about paying attention to those conditions as well, not just the really visible stuff, but what's being built under the surface. And then, Kate, I was just thinking about the brilliant quotes you've got from people across your system that really do show the value of your work. Can I briefly touch on that?
Well, yes, I was thinking related to that. We quite often at the end of meetings, especially sort of small meetings or one-on-one meetings, someone will turn to me or any one of the members of my team, because I've got a fabulous team, and they'll say something like, "Oh, I feel more hopeful now," or "Oh, that's given me loads of ideas, inspiration. Oh, oh, really pleased we had this. Thank you for that." And it just got me thinking this conversation about, can you measure hope? Can you measure inspiration? Can you measure those things? Because they're in quite short supply at the moment. I think we could all do with a bit more of it. And there is something about that. There's something about actually thinking, oh, I can make a difference in my job. I can do something. So I offer that up as a thought about, we need to have hopeful systems.
Thanks, Kate. And I've definitely got lots of hope from this conversation. So we're going to close in the next few minutes. So I'd like to invite anyone in the audience, please do share your reflections, your takeaways in the chat. I'd love to kind of hear what you're taking away from today's conversation. And yeah, there's so much richness in there. I'm going to have to revisit it all. And then I'd have to thank all of our speakers for sharing all of your wisdom, all of your work. And I'd also like to come to you for a final takeaway, final reflection, final thought on where you go next. And would anyone like to kick off with any closing reflections? Kate, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I can just say something on collaboration. The terminology we sometimes use rather than system steward is collaboration manager. And something that I realized quite early on in this journey is if you say you do collaboration, and then what you actually do is your own collaboration, right? You come to me and I'm going to organize everybody collaborating. And then when someone else is doing something, you don't go to their thing, then that's very imbalanced. So we have to spend as much time helping other people with their collaborations as we do on our own stuff, which of course is a funding challenge. But that needs to happen for a balance of power.
Thanks, Kate. Amanda, can I come to you next?
So I think for me, I just wanted to go back to the title a little bit, this thing about sort of pioneering approaches, and to say that pioneering doesn't always have to be like novel and different. And a lot of this, the pioneering is actually doing the really kind of basic stuff that needs to be done. It's kind of it's what you say is like the grunt work of it, but it's what you bring to that. So it's remembering that even though you're doing those things that have to be done, and a lot of it is about changing hearts and minds and behaviors, it's often about the attitude that you bring to it. So finding what it is that can get people to really shift their behaviours. Like for me, one of the biggest outcomes I've had in the last couple of weeks is a commissioner of women's services saying, we want to do the next commission as a partnership and not as a procurement exercise, where we will be jointly responsible for the outcomes. That to me is everything about what has changed. And often it's the intangibles. So if you look at the new Levelling Up agenda, and they talk about the intangibles, like what is that? They put that in their model, the government. And I think it's the intangibles that's the hardest thing to measure. And it's often when you feel that it's changed, but you can't put your finger on it. But I think there are certain things that are very tangible. So it's a matter of collecting the intangibles and the intangibles as you go along on your learning journey together, and creating a learning community, not a commissioning or a procurement. The language often makes us behave in certain ways. So just changing that to a learning community really shifts the needle on that.
Thanks, Amanda. Julian.
Just really briefly to pick up on an earlier question about community engagement. It needs to be meaningful for the people, and it needs to give people something that they want, rather than just an extractive process. I think that's really important. And it's great to be part of this learning group that have come together. I just want to say that it's really inspiring to hear, Kate, Amanda, Layla, Andrew, and I'm learning so much along the way. So, yeah.
Thanks, Julian. Yes, so much of this is about peer support, learning off each other. So yeah, definitely echo that. Layla, how about you? Any takeaways or things on your mind after today's conversation?
Yes, I suppose for me the final thought probably is this what Kate said about being servant to the outcome and servant to the people affected. And in a way, because that's something that I've felt that for HLS, in a way, that is a key component that can be missed, and that therefore there are consequences for that, and they're not necessarily easy consequences. So one of the implications is that your organization is less important than the thing you are trying to achieve. That is not always easy, particularly if you're in a director role, to go with, but you have to kind of stick with that. Otherwise, you will end up corrupted in some way. So that idea that the mission and the purpose and the outcomes for the people is the most important thing. And sometimes you might look a bit foolish as an organization, you might whatever else, but you have to stick with that. And therefore, you have to grapple with the implications. And there's something about growing the system as a system steward, actually growing the total net resource to be active, and not just growing your own organization. And sometimes that might mean, so a number of things, even with things like the CAPSA service, culturally appropriate peer support service, some of it's like step back and let's see who else. Now we've done an experiment, actually what other organizations could be supported to take this forward and be commissioned.
Thanks, Layla. Yeah, really, really important. Yeah, knowing when to step in and when to step back. Yeah, really kind of come out of today's conversation. Andrew, any takeaways from you?
I think it's just been brilliant listening to everybody. I think the takeaway for me is it starts with ourselves in terms of, we can do this at any point in the day. We can invite different behaviours from the people around us by the way we behave.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you to everyone for their comments in the chat. A huge amount of appreciation for everyone sharing their experiences today. I mean, what strikes me from this conversation is hope about just entering into everything with humanity, and also the generosity of you both in your work, in your places, but also as leaders in supporting each other, sharing more widely as well. So yeah, a huge thank you to Kate, Julian and Julie, Amanda, Andrew and Layla. Thank you so much, everyone. The recording will be shared, and we'll also be probably doing a few blogs off the back of this as well to share some of the ideas and this work. Gwen, any final words from you?
Yeah, it just feels like, to Layla's point, I feel like we're growing the net resource from with this group, but with this wonderful community that's been participating in this session. So much love, I think, interaction among the participants, but also with the panel. I can't wait to read through the transcription. It feels like there's so many kind of really powerful insights shared there, as well as in the chat. So just wanted to take a moment to really appreciate and be grateful for that. Taj's one step ahead, and he's put a link to a very brief feedback survey. If this is your only or last session of the week, please, your feedback is really important. It just takes a minute or two to complete, but we hope this is not your last session. It's only Wednesday. We have tomorrow and Friday. We have some great events, including networking events and a closing celebration for HLS week on Friday at 1. You're most welcome to come to that and share what you've taken away from the week, and to also hear about where HLS might be going next and how you can be involved. I think Taj has put a link to the full schedule. And also, yes, just to note that we'll be sharing videos, transcripts, and supporting materials in about a couple of weeks. But I think that's where we'll leave it. Please feel free to give all of our panel, yourselves, just a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much.